I'd like to call the work session to order. I think what we'll do is, first of all, starting from Mr. McDowell, we'll go across. And I'm saying because this is being recorded, and I think they'll know who most of the 5 board members who are here are. I'm expecting 2 more, but if you just introduce yourself and describe your role briefly, if you would.
Bob McDowell, Assistant Superintendent.
Good evening, Rachel Larson, Director of Learning.
Hello, Karen Latterell, Curriculum Coordinator.
Rachel Style, English teacher.
Tracy Cox, 8th grade English teacher.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. The purpose of our meeting today is not to make a decision. We don't do that at work sessions, although sometimes you can get a feel for that, and hopefully we will get a feel for that, but is to learn more, talk more, share more. And we have a rather fat packet in front of us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. McDowell. And Bob, if you just tell us where we go from there.
I'm going to turn it directly over to Rachel Larson, who will be running the presentation tonight.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having us. We are looking forward to having this conversation and clarifying some information and then leaving time for questions and answers. So today's agenda will be providing an explanation of our curriculum cycle process that's very thorough and follows district policy. Then we'll walk you through the core curriculum review, which is what we're presenting to you and what we have presented to you, and focusing on the middle and the high school, which is the proposal before you. Then we're gonna describe what we teach, and that is the standards. And we're gonna give you examples in the standards themselves so that you can see how language is covered and grammar and writing. Then we're gonna discuss the science of reading, walk through the budget overview again, and then leave time for discussion for questions and clarifications. And you do have in front of you, and so do people in the audience, resources for reference. And those resources are copies, just in case you want to look back at, for the October 10th, 2019 presentation, the November 14th presentation, and then also what you received in email on December 6th, the board questions packet for reference. And then we also have a packet for research base underlying the Teachers College reading and writing workshops approach, and then also the HMH into literature research. We also did provide you with a full copy of the Minnesota K-12 academic standards in ELA. And that is the draft copy that we're working off of right now that they don't expect too many changes of. So this presentation, we centered around the synthesis of questions that we've received and forwarded articles that we've received from you. So we're trying to address those as much as we can before we start the question and answer part. So as has been shared with you before, we have a very thorough research-based curriculum review process. And this is the process that's, well, we're now in about month 20. And so we start with our why. Why are we teaching what we teach? Why are we focusing as a department on what we're focusing on? Then we walk through with the committee what our review process are and the steps. Then we look at what are we doing at the elementary level so that we can look at the standards at the elementary level so that we make sure that we're developing a fully articulated K-12 scope and sequence. Then we dove into the current reality. And the current reality is when we look at our current results and what's currently happening in our classrooms. So what is working well? How are our students performing? And what is it we'd like to improve? Then we dive into data analysis. And some of this is just data analysis that Karen and I do within the department. And some of it is involving the teachers with various articles and texts and research that we focus on, but also student achievement results, both in the classroom and MCA or normed assessment data. Then after spending time looking at that, then we start looking at what are our desired results. So now that we have the base of everything, what is it we want to accomplish and provide for our students? And then from that, we start looking at even more of the anchored research that we want to guide our decisions around. And throughout that entire process, we went back on it a lot to review it. When we'd get back together, we'd go back through the desired results and just anchor our thinking in why are we looking into what we're looking into, and why is this important for our students, and how do we deliver experiences for them. We also incorporated the portrait of a graduate lens to make sure that we're meeting the expectations of what the community has said they wanted for experiences within our system. And then we started to dive into the standards articulation, looking at the 612 standards as they relate to middle school and high school. So then, when we start doing that, we get into the UBD, or Understanding by Design Framework approach, for how we start looking into unit design, how we look at priority standards, what is essential for the students, because as you've probably heard, the standards are a lot of breadth. And our task is to really look to find the depth and focus in on the key skills that we want our students to acquire. So from that, then we look at learning targets, and we also will look at differentiation strategies and assessments. So we're still in the process of that last one within the UBD framework. So just to highlight a couple of pieces, over this 18-month period, not only are we focusing on this as a committee, but we're also bringing all of our historical knowledge and research and practice that we've had through curriculum review cycles. I know I'm in my 22nd year, and year 1 in the profession, I was on a curriculum review team. Karen's in year 25, and I don't know if you want to say, but 23. 20-something.
Something, yeah.
Yeah.
Some are more reluctant than
And so it's fun when we think about all the research we've looked at amongst the committee members and the focus that we've had based on our experiences in education, and then really hone in on what are the researchers in the field and the practitioners over a wide span of years looking at with best practices in education, instruction, curriculum, and assessment. And so you can see, and we've been asked if we could invite experts in who we refer to, who we'd invite in. And then also, when we look at articles and research, we're doing so on organizations that spend their priority doing so. They're looking and vetting research, doing meta-analysis, and coming together to predict and do studies and share information on what's working for students in the field of both education and specifically English language arts. So something just to help you understand the depth and the focus of this work and how research-based it is. Our department, we help support the curriculum instruction and assessment within the district. And so this was the last part of the framework of the process that was just shared with you. But specifically just to highlight some of the pieces, we start looking at the district program and department understandings. What are the big ideas we want students to know? And these are already laid out for us. We don't have a choice what we teach. The state tells us what we teach, and that's MDE, and those are the standards, the academic standards as they're laid out. And the standards themselves already have an articulated scope and sequence. But then we dive into what is a specific course or grade level understanding. So then we frame it, by the time a student leaves our course or our grade level, what is it we want our students to be able to know and do? Then we dive deeper into units. Then we start looking at what are the essential questions that we need to ask and we need to frame for students in learning experiences that they need to acquire before they leave a class or a grade level. And then from that, teachers dive into the daily articulation of what it is they teach and how they assess students. So the lesson goals and learning targets are then the individual concepts from the skills that were embedded within the standards. And from that, we look at assessment design, and we've been before you, Melinda Fierro and I and Dr. McDowell, talking about the assessment system within the district and how we look at that. And assessment is of learning and through learning. And so how do teachers get feedback from students as to how they're performing? And then how do they also get feedback as to what the student may still need or how they can challenge a student yet further? So this is a more simplified but very specific thought process to this. Throughout my years in education, originally there was a lot of focus on what we taught, not so much how we taught it or to whom we taught it. It was more just what. What were we teaching? We'd get a textbook And that would be what we'd teach. And we would have to figure out what out of this textbook written by whomever is important to teach students. That's changed. That's no longer the system of education. The system now is, why are we teaching what we're teaching? And then what is it that we're teaching, which are the standards? And then how do we teach? And that's a lot of what we've brought to you before. The how is really important. What are the instructional practices and the professional development that teachers need to deliver the instruction that students need to learn? And then even more importantly, to whom do we teach? So we're not anymore focusing on whole class instruction. It's now whole class instruction, small group instruction, and individual instruction in the classroom. And so who are all of the learners in front of us? We maybe can remember, unless we had some very innovative practices, that we probably had a lot of traditional learning experiences where everyone received the same instruction from the teacher, and then you'd take homework home to practice it. The system's different. Now today, teachers provide skills and contents in a short amount of time, and then students are able to practice those skills in a classroom while the teacher's there to give feedback and help them move forward and focus on skills that they need to continue learning. And then we get to with what we teach, and that has always been around as we know it, and that's the proposal before you. We focus on teaching the standards, but these are the resources, the novels and the books that are part of our request that we have researched and looked at, that we are requesting to use to provide for our students in ELA. So just one other piece to frame our time together this evening is we really struggle to just focus on core sometimes, because as educators, we're constantly looking at all the levels of learning and differentiation in a classroom. Our minds are always going there. However, when we're in a curriculum review process, we're specifically focusing on core classroom. So we're not getting into depth yet on the tier 2 strategy. Well, yes, we do, the tier 2 strategies, but tier 3, as we think about other resources we need, that becomes a part of this process. But the initial curriculum review is tier 1. And we're gonna propose to you some ideas we have to dive into more of the tier 3 conversation at a later time, because there have seemed to be a lot of questions about that level of how we fit students' needs in.
As we spoke to you in October, or when we spoke to you in October, we talked about the middle school recommendation and then also the high school recommendation. This is the middle school recommendation. And I would just like to point out that it does include direct instruction in elements of reading, writing, grammar, and word study. It allows for student choice, and it allows for differentiation quite easily. And then it's also important because it provides time for independent practice. And so when you look at this particular slide, you can see the different types of units that teachers might teach across the year for each grade level. For the high school, as you know, we've recommended a textbook into literature. It's important to note for that this provides teachers with resources and information that they have been coming up with on their own, which takes an incredible amount of time. And when you spend the majority of your time preparing and seeking out resources and trying to discern how ideas fit together, that takes away from the time that teachers can spend working with students one-on-one, giving feedback to students, and simply preparing for the day-to-day instruction that's necessary. As Rachel mentioned, it does not necessarily drive their instruction. The standards drive our instruction. And instead, teachers will use this resource to address or to reach the requirements of the standards. This is an example of the revised or the draft version of the English Language Arts Standards that the Minnesota Department of Education released. You can see that the columns indicate what grade level the code for the actual standard, and then the benchmark. So The code really isn't important for you to see. Other than that, you should realize that 1.1 means it's addressing standard 1. So if you look at the benchmark and you go down grade by grade, you can see how the idea of grammar and conventions of the English language should be addressed in 7th grade, in 8th grade, in 9th grade. And so again, what the teachers do then is they use this to structure their instruction when they're doing writing instruction.
We wanted to provide you with a copy of the standards because there have been questions about, well, are we covering grammar? Are we covering writing? What does that look like? So we wanted you to see what that looks like because again, the scope and sequence are the standards for you. And so we provided those for you specifically in language and the use of English grammar and then writing for you to look at. And you can just see some of the examples as Karen illustrated within the benchmarks. So then just another focus of writing. And this one shows the 8th grade standard benchmark and then the 9 and 10. The one thing about the ELA is they're structured across the entire K-12 spectrum. And so they have the same pillars of what the standards are focusing on, and then they increase in complexity and skill focus as they go up the system. So they're very articulated, and that's why they're organized this way in the document you see.
So I'd like to elaborate just a little bit on that. So if you were to look at the K-12 version of these standards, you would see that writing informational and explanatory texts is started in kindergarten, and the skills required to perform an informative or explanatory text are built upon year by year by year by year by year. So by the time that they get to 12th grade, they've been doing a very articulated scope and sequence in the learning around that writing skill. And it's the same for opinion and argumentation, and the same for narrative writing. There's a research strand in there as well. And so it builds K-12. Rachel mentioned the pillars in the standards. This is an example. If you look in the green column in the middle, you'll see that the standards address reading, writing, speaking, viewing, listening, and media literacy, and then language. And I'd just like to clarify that in the language strand, that really focuses a lot on vocabulary development and grammar and conventions. So there's been a lot of discussion about the science of reading. And just to make sure that I'm staying up with my research, I've been doing a lot of reading lately. And I have been over the last few years attending a lot of seminars put on by dyslexia advocates or put on by Pacer Center, which is a place where, how would you describe Pacer?
Parent support and advocacy through special education.
And this is one model of reading that comes up frequently with within the dyslexia community or within special education, and it's Scarborough's reading rope. And you'll see on the left-hand side the two bolded boxes, language comprehension and word recognition, are the foundations of literacy. And then underneath it, they give you some substrands that are important to build language comprehension and to build word recognition. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind with this, that when they're talking about the science of reading, it starts very early in a child's life. And learning to read, I'm still learning to read, and I'm 50. And so it never ends, but eventually those components become woven together so that there's an automaticity or a fluidity of the skills so that you can focus mostly on comprehension. This is very similar. I haven't seen anything that says it's built on Gao and Tumner's simple view of reading, but it's very similar to Gao and Tumner's simple view of reading, which also shows up quite a bit in the dyslexia literature. They maintain that oral language development and decoding, which would be the word recognition, that if you can combine those two things, students will have comprehension. So I just wanted to compare that with this. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see it broken out a little bit more about where you might see these types of things being taught. So you can see that with phonemic awareness and phonics, that they start heavily in early literacy, and then they fade. And I'm just addressing K-12. I'm not talking birth to 3 or preschool or anything like that. So they'll fade. Fluency with reading starts to pick up when a child begins to read, which very typically is in the first grade approximately. Some will read earlier than that, but typically then we start working on fluency at that point. As you can see with vocabulary comprehension, oral language development, critical thinking, writing and grammar, those are skill areas that we focus on throughout their entire career in our school system. And then spelling is sort of an outgrowth of decoding or phonics. And you'll notice that starting in kindergarten, we start to move students into a standardized spelling. But I also think it's very important to know that children go through a continuum of spelling development, and it's not 0 to 60. There are very distinct stages of spelling development where children will spell incorrectly, but they're on that continuum making their way toward becoming appropriate spellers. Spelling, we teach spelling up through 5th grade. I noticed in Seidenberg's novel, what is it called? Reading in Plain Sight, or
Language at the speed of sight.
Language at the Speed of Sight. He does mention that spelling instruction ends at 4th grade. We do take it through 5th grade, although some of our students have finished it by 5th grade. You'll notice too that we have asterisks there. Just because a skill fades out in general education doesn't mean we completely stop teaching it. So phonemic awareness, phonics, and spelling, you'll see all have asterisks, and those items can be addressed with students who still have needs, though those are most likely addressed outside of the core classroom, especially as they get older.
Kara, is that in this packet?
Yep, it's on page 7 of the very top handout.
Actually, board members, you got copies of the past presentations. I don't have a
Okay.
copy of tonight's.
Oh,
Okay, that's fine.
you can have mine, it's full notes.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I like this slide a lot. It's really good.
I do want to say that it's adapted from something, you can see the information is adapted down below.
Karen, will this be available on the website?
We certainly can make that available. Go ahead. It should be in this packet, shouldn't it? Okay.
Can I see?
You didn't get it, okay.
Would you see back if there's an extra?
We're going to get
Couple
copies for
copies
you
with this young
of
lady
tonight's
on the front?
presentation. My apologies for that.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob.
All right, should I continue?
Please.
Okay. What we've talked about not just adopting curriculum, we've also talked about instructional practices. And the instructional practice that our teachers are very excited about is the workshop model. And I want to point out that a variety of different things happen during the workshop model. So for example, there will be whole group direct instruction, very explicit teacher modeling, gradual release of responsibility so that students get an attempt and apply the skill with supervision. And that usually happens in a mini lesson format. And when I say mini lesson, somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes, probably around 12 or so is the ideal.
There's more coming.
I'm getting more maybe.
In addition to the mini lesson, the teacher then also works with small group instruction and individual conferring. Now at the secondary level with larger class sizes, it's most efficient to do this from a small group perspective. And so one of the things that we talked about this summer when we did some work together this summer with middle school is that once you're done with your mini lesson and you send your students back to work at their desks, you keep, 5 kids, 6 kids that you plan to work with, so that they don't have to run around and be pulled back again. And you can do direct instruction with them right there, and then send them off and go over to maybe a table and do table group instruction. So during the, after the mini lesson, when students are applying their work, the teacher's busy working with students in small groups and, when available, individual conferring. And this would take place during independent reading or independent writing time where students are applying. It might also take place during book club. So a lot of times in independent reading, students will build book clubs so that they can read and talk about the books.
How long
Director
does-
Riley?
How long does that usually last, the conferring portion with the one student?
That depends on the student, but really around 3 minutes or so. Maybe more.
Teachers may also prioritize, so if there's a student whose skills are lagging a little bit
Yep.
more, they may spend more frequency with conferring or more time within that schedule.
And it really does vary depending on what you're discussing while you're conferring and the type of reading conference that you're doing. Some are more intensive because they're called research, decide, teach. You're watching the student read, you're researching what skills and practices they're doing while they read. You make a decision on the spot, and then you teach them a point and have them practice it. So those take a little bit longer. Oftentimes, teachers will stop the workshop in the middle and extend a mini lesson, talk about what he or she is seeing, so that students can apply. It's also a really good way, people's minds wander, and sometimes kids need to be reminded that, remember, this is our focus. But that's up to the teacher, because sometimes when kids are really motoring along, you don't want to interrupt them. So the teachers have the flexibility to make those on-the-fly decisions. And then finally, at the end, there's a quick share out. It may not involve every student sharing with the entire group, because that obviously will take quite a bit of time. But you might have partner or small group share. The teacher might have a variety of, like a handful of students share out. So there are different ways that teachers can handle that.
So one thing to clarify too is the workshop model is an instructional model. It doesn't correlate to a textbook or a certain company or style. So sometimes there's confusion as, are the units of study the workshop model? No, they fit nicely within the workshop model, but that's not synonymous. The workshop model is an instructional approach. One of the reasons why the workshop model yields high results is because of the support it provides for all learners. And you can imagine through Karen's explanation of just how that happens. Because when we traditionally teach in just a whole class format, it's very difficult for teachers to have time individually with kids or in small groups, really understanding where their skill level's at and how they can redirect learning or provide extra support. And so it's a very responsive teaching strategy in groups for all levels of learners. It also, because of the framework, you have to provide, you don't get a choice to have differentiated resources, because when students are in small groups or individually being instructed, it's at the level they need to be stretched and to be pushed and to be instructed. And so there are a variety of strategies that are used. We also see an increase in student ownership and engagement, and I think we've shared this before with you, that in a whole class environment or with a whole class novel, it's easier to disengage. But when you're responsible and your teacher's meeting with you, even if it's once a week, I used to confer with students every Friday. Friday was a day that we would just book to confer, and then they do small groups when I wasn't conferring individually or in small groups with them. And so they are engaged in the learning. They're not listening to the teacher teach the entire hour. They're a part of the learning. And then this model also provides the option for both teacher-selected and student-selected books. And this is one thing that I think is important to highlight, because sometimes people worry that students selecting books, they may not be challenged, or they may, always go towards the same genre. They may not stretch themselves as readers. But just to highlight that it's also teacher-selected, so that there's coaching involved, and sometimes there's directive involved if there needs to be. So it's not just fully, I get to read whatever I want when I want. But we do want to support student choice as much as possible. So one of the questions that has arisen a few times is, if we were to postpone this, what would be the impact? And I wanted to share this with you. This is a spreadsheet. So if you look at the spreadsheet on the left side, the first column takes you through our policy for our years of curriculum review. So year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and 5. And that's not always in that year. Sometimes they blend depending upon where we're at within the process. But then if you look at the bottom of this, it says budget allocation and priorities continue for 2 to 3 years so that implementation is scaffolded for maximum impact and application. And I think we've shared that before, that we can't do all the changes at one time because we need supported and scaffolded professional development and also application in the classroom. And then red text indicates it is incorporated into budget projections multiple years due to the significant investment required. So like the ELA proposal, even though we have a total amount of the package, we have to look at how we spend that along with the scaffolded PD across 2 to 3 years. And the red italicized information indicates just a delay or postponement due to budget reductions. And this is where, if we are asked and we want to show you what happens when the delay takes place. So if you look at the 2018-2019 year, we were unable to finish the elementary writing, professional development, and application in grades 3 through 5. So that now has been pushed to 2019-2020. You see that in the bottom row under year 4 and 5. And so we're still focusing on that, and also year 3. So that now has to be pushed into this year, impacting what's available for this year budget. And so then, right now for this year, we've postponed social emotional curriculum review and science review at this point because we do not have the budget to support that. We've dove a little bit into physical education because they have new standards that are supposed to be applied, but we don't have the full resources to do that. We're also in the middle of looking at our science review, and we've been studying the next generation science standards for a couple of years. But what happens is when something major within the state gets postponed and it's directly correlated to our budget, we have to push that out, and then that impacts the next few years. So you can see the temporary plans we have depending upon the budget going into the next fiscal year, 21, and what the health will be of reinstatement of our curriculum and PD budgets. If there is a reinstatement of the curriculum and PD budgets for FY21 and we move forward with this proposal, we'll be on track again. And one of the biggest concerns for us is not only staying up to date with MDE's expectations, but also science. The new science standards will be assessed in the MCA4 in 2023. And there's a lot of work in science. The ELA standards, very minimal changes. In fact, they're condensing them mostly so that there's not as many of them, and they're changing some of the language to be more culturally responsive, adding a couple of media literacy components, but they're not changing much. Science, however, is a new approach, so a lot of resources are going to be required for that. So this just explains a little bit of the impact when things get delayed or there are significant budget cuts, what we do within the department to reappropriate funds to make sure we're hitting what's essential, but then also continuing what's currently being implemented.
Question?
Yes.
So, stay on this slide once.
Sure.
So normally, I think you described it, it's an 18-month process. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, 2018, 2019, that's when it begins?
That's when the review and study begin. Yep.
Okay, and so then if you go 2019-20, that's when the adoption comes forward?
Yep, correct.
And then 2020 is really implementation?
For everybody.
Okay.
Yep. And the original investment that Chair Potocnik is referring to is it requires a lot of time for us to have teachers studying and researching materials to bring a recommendation for you. So that's what's prioritized within the budget for that to occur.
The only other thing I would personally am a little sensitive to is when it says it's due to budget cuts. I've been
Sure.
in education many years. There's
We have a
always,
lot of that.
I don't know if I'd call it budget cutting. Again, you're restricted sometimes by how much money you have.
Yep.
And that's true. I wish it weren't that way, but it is. So, so for example, both for 20 and 21, that's an attempt to provide for expenditures over 2 years, where it's got secondary
Yes,
literacy.
correct, yep.
Or is it 3 years?
Yeah, although.
It depends on the budget. As you said, we're constantly adjusting to cuts, which is why we have to really stay focused on what's priority and then what's required through the state, because we're always adjusting the budget.
Okay, thank you.
So then I tried to lay this out in a different format for you. This is the same information and the same numbers that were originally brought to you on October 10th and November 14th. It's just laid out differently, and it has more specifics. So the actual proposal before you for this year to approve is a total cost of $160,820. And if you look at the left column, it's organized first out of curriculum because curriculum and PD are two separate budgets. So that's why that's separated there. So the cost of the 11th grade textbook, the HMH into literature, is $55,000, and that's teacher materials and student textbooks. For 11th grade. Did I?
No, I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. And then the teacher's college units of study, reading and writing are 8,000. That's the middle school teacher materials. Then also under curriculum are classroom books, novels, and materials. And that's for both the high school and the middle school. And that's half of the original request. That's a strong priority because we haven't had this cycle for 10 years.
So can I just clarify? So for the teachers' college units of study, reading and writing, that's a lot less expensive. Is that because there isn't actually like a textbook? It's all the work that the students are doing is based on the classroom books, novels, and materials in the bottom slide?
Yes, and it follows our standards. And so when we look at the units of study, we break it down in the standards. And we actually have Tracy Cox brought copies so you can see their materials that are very explicit. But it's not a textbook that the students go home with. There are different resources the students use.
Buying the teacher manual for those.
Yes,
for that
largely.
curriculum.
Yep, that's a great way to think about it.
And then, so then it's a lot of materials that you're generating in the classroom that it just isn't a textbook. This might be paper or other books, right?
Yes.
Other materials.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, and that's where we would purchase through, what you see right below that is classroom books, novels, and other materials. So it might be subscriptions to informational text or periodicals or something that a teacher would want
So
to.
teachers have some flexibility in what they want to
Yes.
spend.
Yep.
And then, why is it only 11th grade for the textbook?
Good question. The 11th grade, so you would normally assume that we would start with 9th grade, that if we were going to reduce what we could do, that we would start in chronological order. However, conversation with the committee in looking at just their needs within a department and not having access for 10 years is that the 11th grade has the biggest need for updated materials and resources to support student learning and for those teachers to dive in. And so in having conversation with the 9th grade teachers, the 10th grade teachers, 11th and 12th grade teachers, as a department and curriculum committee, they all agreed that the priority should be 11th grade because that doesn't need, the textbook doesn't need the articulation right now. Starting with 9th first, then 10th to 11th, we can introduce the textbook there and support that process. It also gives us a great opportunity to assess the textbook. What is this doing as a material for our students, and what are we liking about it, and what are we using, what do we find helpful, what are the students engaging with, and then we can go forward from there.
So
Would that be?
Sorry. So then going forward, what would the plan be? Would you come back like next year and ask for, and decide which grade you want to do next?
Yes.
So that's kind of an unknown right now.
We know we would go to 9th grade.
Okay.
Yep, that
So
we
you
would start back. 9th grade would be the
Probably
priority.
fill in 10th.
Yep. Then 12.
And so, and it would be a similar, probably, it would be a similar cost, probably the 55,000 for that material, and then whatever professional development.
Yep.
Liz?
Go
For
ahead,
the
Liz,
meeting
I'll
that
follow up.
we had Tuesday, when you were showing the additional, if we had the 550,000 put back in.
Yep.
Would those textbooks be in that number?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's just, I wanted to follow up with
Do you want
Tuesday. I'm glad
the
you brought that
last-
up. The last slide's fine. So the cost of this, as we talked on Tuesday, remember our large budget, which is called the DW7 budget, is part of that preliminary budget that gets approved as we're gonna put this sandbox of money in there. This 160 is pulled out of that. So we have that in our budget. This isn't additional outside of a budget that we need from somewhere. So
Yeah.
just trying to help connect those dots
See,
again.
couple questions and they're related. I'm not saying do it this way as much as I'm saying, okay, this might be. It might be useful if you had year one and then columns going
Sure.
vertically that said year two, year three.
That makes a lot of sense.
Plus, it also seems to me it would be logical that you decide right now when you're reviewing it, okay, this is most immediate 11th grade. Next year, it's whatever grade. Third year, it's whatever grade. The question becomes technically, and I think we have to establish an understanding of that. We adopt the curriculum. Is it one decision? But we're going to implement it over 3 years. Now, what may happen, but that's reality, that's how schools work. Year two, you're in a worse financial predicament, so you may or may not get it, but if things are there, that's a top priority with us, because we've already adopted it, and it's pretty important to do it. But again, so you look out and you say, total is going to be 550,000 or whatever the amount is for materials, whatever the amount is for professional development. Does that make sense?
That's exactly
And
right.
that may be slide 2, I don't know,
Yep.
that's coming next.
Here's, yep.
Yep.
So thank you.
Quick
Sure.
follow-up. So your comment earlier is that the 160,000 is already in the
In the budget.
budget for this year.
Yep.
So if we were to add something,
You go to the
that would
next slide.
be above and beyond the budget for this year,
Correct.
so. okay.
Yep, so let's say that you said, you know what, it's a priority, it sounds, to provide the teachers and students with classroom books, novels, and materials, not the textbook. We would like to increase that amount, that you would have to find money somewhere to do that because that's not within the curriculum and PD budget. And as Chair Potacek was saying, we will come back to you next year with wherever the costs land, just because any cost would be over $50,000. So we would be back regardless to ask for the next steps. And as you alluded to with budgets and the unpredictability, we know that a priority for next year would be the continuation of this. That would be, we have the standard costs that are part of annual expenses of supporting curriculum across the district, but this would be a priority. We just may have to change how much we could do next year.
And what I would say to that, if you, in the past, what we've done is if you look at the elementary adoption of the curriculum, it really is kind of in the same way that we did. If you remember, the closest thing to this right now, John Perry presented the technology package that was over 3 years. So the board approved the whole thing. And we knew that it was going to be X amount, and X amount over the 3 years, but the approval was for that whole piece. That's
Yeah.
kind of the same way we did the elementary curriculum last time, because we were certain, I think to your point, Mike, we were certain at that time, back to the timeline, we can do this much this year, this much this year, and this much this year, because we already had that in our mind that the money would be there.
See, and I'm saying, to me, it makes sense, you approve the curriculum adoption once.
Correct.
What you may have difficulty in practice and implementation is some years, the money may not be there. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen, and as you tried to show with your master chart, when you're doing this across the district, in various curriculum areas, you also got to be sensitive to the fact that, okay, somebody else is going to be in line for this. So you got to be careful you don't stack up too much, but it does involve a lot of prior and past planning as well as future planning.
Yeah, I think just to further clarify that point, I agree that it would be good to approve the whole curriculum plan and any additional pieces that we want to see happen right now, maybe clarify that. But then I do think we want to have updates every year, so
Yeah.
sort of like doing it 1 year at a time, but also it makes sense to do the whole thing all at once too.
And we would be revisiting, if this is approved, we would be bringing some of these pieces to you because we'd need to have you approve the $50,000 process. So it would come back to you multiple times.
Right, okay.
So then, as we looked at, this is just the next slide that shows the total cost over the entire 3-year implementation. So if it were as simple as dividing it across 3 years, you would basically have roughly $160,000 each of the 3 years, depending upon the budget and the prioritization for what we'd look at. But again, that would depend upon the health of the budget and other priorities. So with that, those were the pieces that we just tried to synthesize that we gathered from a lot of the questions and clarifications that were asked. So now we'd like to open this up to you to ask any questions and have conversation.
Sure.
And
Thank you. So, my question all along has been teacher autonomy. So if we could hear, maybe first from you, Tracy, like, when I look at this, I see a lot of now say this, and that would, I feel like it would bug me to have.
So I don't mean to well, I do mean to interrupt, stop you for a second. Because it's hard, I was back there, it's hard if we don't talk directly into the mics for the audience to hear us.
Okay.
And I know that it's weird when you're trying to look down the
Sorry,
table.
I will repeat my
But just for
question.
the audience, it's hard for them to hear.
Thanks for saying
So
that.
sorry for interrupting.
That's okay. I had just mentioned that my question all along has been teacher autonomy, and when I look at this, there's a lot of say this, now say this, and a lot of quotes, and now do this, and I feel like it would be hard for me to have that, like, you have to do it like this. So can you speak to what it's like actually in the classroom?
Sure. Well, I definitely don't feel like I have to follow that script word for word. The beautiful thing about having the script, however, is you can imagine a first-year teacher walking in and being presented, no matter what district they're in, with the curriculum that they've been presented. And the beautiful thing about that is I can go through, and some of the ways that they say things are ways that, oh, that's wonderful. That's exactly how I want to explain it to kids. And I'll use some of that word choice. But I always have and I don't follow it, the script exactly word for word, because I teach in such a way where I want it to be natural. But there are definitely ideas in there. And of course, the main idea of the mini lesson is really what I'm getting at. And so they encourage, here's the story I shared to hook the kids. What's a story that you have that you can hook the kids? So I'll think of something, well, last night when I was reading my book at home, I thought of you kids when I was thinking about how we read nonfiction texts. And so, of course, I personalize it to myself. So I absolutely feel that I follow that because I know it hits the standards, but I make it my own.
And do you think, just as a follow-up to that, if I may,
Please.
so you mentioned first-year teachers and they would appreciate, do you think they can also make it their own and not, that it wouldn't be scripted for them?
I do, because teaching is both an art and a science. And one of our pieces as teachers that we know is that we put the art of teaching into each lesson. And I think as we're working as a team, the four of us, and I'll just speak with the collaboration that we've had with Oakland has been one of the most exciting things that I've experienced as a teacher. The four of us as 8th grade teachers, we are texting after school, emailing, we're doing FaceTime calls, we are, what are you doing? How did this work? And one of the teachers there is a new teacher and wasn't a part of the curriculum, of course, because she wasn't here. But she has absolutely just jumped right in, and I think it gives you that peace of mind to say, yep, I hit on all those points, and it's there if I need it, but the main goal is to get the kids here. And how I'm gonna get there has to be part of the art of teaching.
Thank you.
Tina?
Can I jump way back to the beginning, as far as the committee being formed? I've gotten a lot of questions from people out in the community of who exactly is on the committee, and does it follow statute when it says it has to be comprised of 2/3 of community residents?
What statute are you referring to with that?
120B.11.
Oh, the one that was in the email.
Yep.
That statute pertains, even though it includes curriculum, that statute pertains specifically to school improvement processes. So that's the World's Best Workforce Committee and the Curriculum Advisory Committee. So what we have in the district that we're currently operating off is Results Policy 1.2. And that's where you find those descriptions for what we follow, so it's different. So that, it's confusing when you look at that.
No,
but
I don't
that's-
know that I'm confused, and I think I might have a little different perspective than you do on what that is, because right away it says, for curriculum, reviewing curriculum, instruction, and student achievement, what you strive for the world's best workforce, that's secondary in nature, and the definitions are in there. So I don't know if I'm necessarily confused, but I think I might have a little bit different understanding.
Sure. Well, that would be part of the updated process. 2 weeks ago, we were supposed to meet as a policy team to look at Policy 616 within the district, and so we can definitely have that conversation, but we're currently following board policy as it exists right now.
So there wasn't community members on this one
No.
or past?
Correct.
Because the only one I
We've
could
never
find
in
off
the
the
district.
website was back from Ryan Lager.
Yep, we've never had that. The policy, we can look online and see what the last date of the approval was, but we're following everything that's currently in policy for the district.
Can I follow
Jen?
up on that? Thanks, Chair. I was on a CAC committee as a resident, as a parent.
Good point.
So what is the difference? There is something there.
So we're going to get into semantics, and we probably want to go, we can obviously go through that, but there are 3 different levels of committee work that happen when it comes to curriculum instruction and assessment. So it's a large umbrella term, which is the statute that you're referring to. The first is and relates to the world's best workforce, which does have to have a majority of the members from the community, and then further subdivides that into who those need to be. The second is the Curriculum Advisory Committee. The Curriculum Advisory Committee is outlined in, I believe it's that statute or it's the subsequent statute. I don't have it in front of me.
Site team?
You can have a site team. A site team is a team that you may put together. It's not a requirement under statute, but it follows the directive of the curriculum advisory team. But it's not specific to the curriculum review process, which in itself is a more specific and detailed process, which is what we're talking about tonight. Curriculum Advisory Committee is a committee that meets throughout the course of the school year, which is comprised of both staff, students, and parents and community members, which runs through the length of the school year. It used to be a combination of CAC and World's Best Workforce. The Curriculum Advisory Committee is the committee that oversees the flow of curriculum packages as they come to be ready to be presented to the school board for adoption. So for example, at the most basic level, you might have teachers every year. We ask in the fall or in the spring of the previous year to put together recommendations for course offerings. That's where you as a board most oftentimes see it. So they put it through as a course offering. It goes through the steps in the process that's in our policy and procedures for course revisions, adoptions, and changes. And then the Curriculum Advisory Committee, or CAC, which is what is outlined in that process there, goes through and reviews that to make sure that it is worthy of or ready to be brought to the school board. Prior to then, that committee brings it to my office. I make sure that it looks like it's in order before Rachel or whoever would be presenting it to you.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that too, there are times, I can remember, I'm not advocating for or against that, when the board has had a curriculum advisory committee.
Yep, and the
But
board.
particularly, it was limited to pretty much new courses, what are you going to add, what are you going to
Correct.
take out, that sort of thing.
Which is different than, so in practice, and in previous practice, in this district and in other districts, the practice has been that there are curriculum review processes, which is what was outlined up here for specific packages, That is, in our historical practice, been where teachers come together along with members of the district, so it probably is your curriculum coordinator over time, whoever's sitting in a director's seat at that time, and then anyone else that they bring along to go through the actual curriculum review process. That group then would bring that piece to the CAC committee, to which the CAC committee would review it, which then would come, same process at that point as a change or course proposal.
Okay, I think we're kind of just gone way
So-
too deep, and I was just kind of looking to see if community members were involved according to how they're supposed to be.
Sarah?
Can I just follow up? So in this process, though, this was a curriculum review process that followed the process you laid out at the beginning. It hasn't necessarily gone to the CAC committee.
It already has,
Oh, it
which is
has.
comprised of students, community members, parents, and
Okay,
teachers.
okay.
That
Yeah,
are
I'm
not
just
part
curious,
of the
'cause we haven't talked
curriculum
about that
committee.
before. Okay.
So that is followed.
Yeah. Would it be beneficial? I mean, I really appreciated the time that we had to meet. We talked a
did
little
too.
bit about how, this process has felt, for lack of a better word, unfortunate, because I think there's been a lot of confusion and maybe some hurt feelings, and that certainly isn't in anybody's best interest, right? It's not good for anybody. So, in the future, is there some way for us to maybe think about, not necessarily that we have the answers now, but just asking the question, is there a way that we can maybe look at improving that process so that we have a little bit more, like this information that we've had today has been fantastic. And I think it's helpful for us, and it's also helpful for the community. Would it be possible to have, is it something we could think about, having parents or students involved in this, the actual curriculum review process, It's just something to think about.
And I think that'll be part of that 616 is up for
616, yeah.
review. So
Yeah.
that, from that standpoint, it's very timely that if
Yeah.
there are changes we want to make, and I think we've talked about it a couple different times, even simple things like putting in little benchmark spots when it seems appropriate to have a group come to the board, even though we might just be in year one of that chart, so that the board gets an update of, just a reminder, here's where we are with this curriculum package. We're not anywhere near approval, but we're just getting done with reviewing, or just gonna start reviewing potential pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that we set that cycle up.
And I think building on that, because we have discussed that a little bit, early in the process, year one, like we know science is going to be year one, correct? And I think kind of an overview of what are the big issues in that area. Just like in reading, most curriculum areas, there are issues. And even early on, to hear what the tussles are going to be, or what the philosophies are going to be, kind of a preview.
Yep.
And again, board getting an opportunity to do that. And there's a number of ways you could do that. You could do that with the whole board. You might have a curriculum committee, which at times we've had. Another part of what may come early, what's the latitude? How much do we have to spend, or what can we expect? In some areas, and you know that better than I do for this location, certain curriculums cost a lot more, and because of capital or whatever is there. So I'm saying, and then align it with policy.
Yeah, we'd appreciate the opportunity to have those check-in points and have conversation. This is my 7th year in the district, and we've never received these many questions or a board that was this interested in the process. We followed the process that was just, you take your initial proposal to the board, and then you ask for final approval. And that's just always been the way we've done it. But I think this is really productive and healthy to have and establish those checkpoints of conversation. So we're working together and progressing together so that you don't have it just in front of you, and then you have all these questions that you have unanswered, and then it turns into a, well, we're here for final approval, but now we're having questions, and that just wasn't a process that felt good.
Late in the game.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, can I just,
Please.
so we do have a curriculum advisory committee currently. And there are community members, parents, students, and this already went through that process? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yep.
Can we get that list? Because I haven't seen it. I looked for it online on our website
Sure.
and I couldn't find it.
Yep.
Rachel, how often does that group meet?
4 times a year, depending upon the needs. So we may call the committee together if there's a need for something. You know, the pathways conversation could be something that we may need to adjust the calendar to bring certain things to it.
Yeah.
Shelley? you had a
Well, I
question?
was just going to say, I think it would have been good to know that earlier, that it went, I didn't even know that committee still
I didn't
existed.
either, yeah.
So I think, and just future work for everybody is we, I think, are always asking the question, were their parents involved, were
Yeah.
their students involved? So just to have that on the forefront, like here's how they were involved, here's maybe some of the things they brought up and what was tweaked because of their suggestions, I think that'd be helpful to know.
Yeah, because there's fabulous conversation.
I think one of the benefits, not to hound on this too much, but one of my top questions that I think I asked in my email and I have on my notes today is, and we've kind of gotten close to it, but it's not super clear, what is the why? What is the, you've said we started there, we asking what is the why? And what it sounds like there's an interest in is going to a workshop model rather than what we currently have, which is more of a whole class model. And I appreciate that, I think that's great. But maybe because this is a public meeting, if there's some way we could sort of express in a sentence or two, like why is that better? How does that help our kids?
Yeah.
Good start.
We all want to answer this. We're all looking.
So I jumped on board a year ago. I had read the novel Approach a year ago and actually bumped into Karen late summer and I said, I have a really cool idea for a partnership grant. What if we, and she said, well, actually our third graders are doing mysteries and you want to try getting a mystery grant. And that's kind of, for me, the inception of my excitement around this work was getting kids in book clubs from Kate Roberts' novel Approach. And she talked about the idea that sometimes we might do things as a whole class and do some modeling together, but then we also had that gradual release of skill for kids to try things on their own. And so that's how I structure my syllabus, so that we're doing things together sometimes, or doing things in book clubs sometimes, or doing things individually sometimes. And so 3 days a week, my kids start off reading their independent reading book. They're filling out reading bookmarks that they physically place in their book, kind of highlighting character develops through conflict right here, a quote that shows thematic development right here. And so they're individually reading and engaging with their book. While the kids are doing that, I'm meeting with students. I meet with 3 to 4 students every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I think that's been probably the best way for me to develop relationships with them, have conversations with them, stretch them in their learning. Sometimes the book are their comfort books, sometimes they're stretch books, and kind of meeting them and differentiate every single time I meet with them. And sometimes we lap back and we meet multiple times throughout the semester. We're doing things together. So today we started off with the fallacies of logic mini lesson together. And then in their book clubs, they got to apply that to the mystery novels they're reading. And then 2 days a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, we're ending our workshop with writing. And so it's not just reading. I know there's a lot of conversation about reading, but there's a lot of writing instruction as well. And I do have a teacher copy of the literature book, Into Literature. And so I'm using that for the curriculum mapping in the background. And so I'm trying to kind of blend both pieces there. So the textbook provides that skeleton, so to speak, of the continuum of curriculum. And then the workshop is really the delivery model I use to incorporate that. And I think the thing I'm most excited about with the independent reading books is kids are able to pick books that essentially mirror who they are. Not all of our books in our curriculum kind of reflect who they are, whether that's their gender, their diversity, their race, their interests, their passions, certainly science fiction for some of them. I don't think we've had new books in the curriculum since about 2003, outside of maybe a grant or a special project here and there. So they find things that stoke their interests, but then we make those self-to-text connections, those text-to-text connections, and that's been really rewarding for me.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Others? Mark?
I think Tracy was going to
Tracy.
Okay.
I knew I saw him.
That's okay. Yeah, definitely, no matter what curriculum, if I were teaching any curriculum, I would use the workshop model as my organization of how I teach. With kids, we start out with bell work, which is where we do some pretty intensive grammar work. And that seems to be just the right amount of time for kids. We move into then the mini lesson, and what I just notice is kids for that 10 to 12 minutes, they're engaged. They know that after the skill is modeled for them, they get a chance to try it with their own book. And we're just finishing a literary nonfiction unit, and so we've been talking about skills that that are even helping me improve as a reader. And I think I'm a pretty good reader, but on one particular day, we were talking about how authors put subtopics in texts. And sometimes we just glide over those and wonder, well, this doesn't seem to fit. But we talked as a class of how those are there for a reason, and we have to stop and pause and make connections to the other parts of the text. And that's really higher level thinking. And so then they get a chance, after I modeled that for them, to go back into their own text at their level and try it. And the beautiful thing about the conferring is, just like Rachel said, it's a chance for me to talk with kids at a text they feel successful at. And so if we were in a textbook or a book that we had all agreed that we're all reading, I fear that my kids who maybe struggle with reading wouldn't be able to engage and feel successful because they're not able to talk about the text, because they're not comprehending it. So the workshop model, there's just so many positives to it. And I would also say the collaboration piece is something that we're really working with students. Can you talk about texts? Can you carry on a conversation with someone? So within that small group time or during our share time at the end, giving them a chance to collaborate with one another and to hear their peers' ideas and to be challenged by their peers. Oh, you're reading that or you're tracking that in your book? I never thought about tracking cause and effect. Oh yeah, I'm gonna do that too. So those are the kinds of conversations that the workshop model really brings about. And I can't say enough about it. I've just seen the kids grow, and it's been a great way to keep them engaged too.
Can I add
Yeah.
one more thing real quick too? I think the last thing I would think that I would add to this is I have found that I don't miss out on any kids. You know, sometimes if you're doing a whole class novel, you assume they're all with you. They're nodding and they're bobbing and they're, you know, pretending to do whatever.
Don't call on me.
Right, don't call on me. But I can find when I'm sitting down with a kid at my table, you know, how was your weekend? How was it going? Tell me about a character in your book. You can more quickly tap into where they're struggling and provide that individualized support. So when you see them at their groups or you see them in their spaces, you know exactly what they need. And I think that has been the greatest teaching moment for me, is to kind of recognize I can still differentiate in those large spaces. And even at the whole class level too, because I'm still meeting with them. Even if we're doing a whole class novel, we're still meeting every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I've been able to capture more kids in a way I hadn't been able to before.
Thank you. Tina?
I have two things, and they're very different. Would it be possible, or is it possible, or would you consider still utilizing some of the greats and doing a whole class novel portion, utilizing the workshop model? I mean, would that be something you would be willing to add into that? I am kind of concerned about them falling away, because you can learn and get so much out of those. My second is just a little ponder, and it doesn't really have anything to do with just the middle school per se, but I would like to see the entire literacy staff trained in letters. And you can even take out OG if you do the letters, because it's similar, yeah. So I don't know if that is something we're considering, and if we could maybe look into that or be intentful, because I think that PD and the professional development, and you can use that with any curriculum that you choose. So that's just a thought I have. I wish I was involved earlier on, but.
Could you repeat your first? I couldn't hear.
I was wondering if it would be possible for them to add in some of the great novels and use it as a whole, the classics, and use, not that they're not all great. And use it, you know, as a whole class and still incorporate it with the workshop model.
as they're talking, the letters, the proposal and the budget breakdown that we shared with you, we would love to plan on doing that. This would be the first part, and then add to that, because once they're utilizing materials and practices, then that training can be applied into this environment. That training is for small group instruction, and if we don't have the structure of workshop in place that teachers have had the PD on, they don't have the model in the classroom to fit in and apply the letters. So yes, that is one of our priorities moving forward to do. We just can't do that right now, so it's not in front of you as a proposal.
Yeah, I
But
just
it's
don't-
part of our plan.
I'm not a fan of the opt-in. I want all
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, I guess I would agree.
Liz?
So,
Or
did you
I'm sorry.
want
Go
the
ahead.
Larry,
class?
answer.
Yeah,
Let-
go ahead.
let him
You want
answer.
it? Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm referring to 180 Days by Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle. I also mentioned A Novel Approach by Kate Roberts, which was the other text that have kind of driven our conversations around workshop. And so I'm referencing on page 46, the chart they use to kind of guide a year-long planning model. And so that's what I do in my classroom. And it's a combination of free choice book, a book club, and a core work, and that rotation over and over again. So for that core work, for example, I just finished Fahrenheit 451. So there's definitely still a place for core learning and a place for classic canon in the classroom. So it's not like we're saying we're all going to read Harry Potter and every day.
It's a good
But,
question.
but that's
I
good,
think that's a
because
really
I
good
have
point.
had individual community members say to me, do we lose that common culture?
Yeah, so we would
Some
take
of
labs around certain
great
skill
question.
sets, and certain core texts would model different things for kids, but then, okay, we've taught these skills, now gradual release, you go try it out with your book club selection, and there would be, key selections we would pick. And then individually, can you try it on your own? And so you're kind of taking these strands of learning and scaffolding them among multiple different settings. So I'm glad you asked that.
Do colleges and universities, and I go back ancient history, but they used to send incoming freshmen a list of books, novels, other works that they should have read?
My son just went to college this year, and I did not receive that. He was probably glad I didn't receive that, because I would have had him read a few. No, but one thing I was just going to mention is, as an eighth grade team, we sat down and looked at the very few class sets of novels that we have left. I mean, most of them are falling apart. Many are outdated. We've talked about the kids not being as engaged with the texts that we have. But we did agree that we do think that it is imperative that we teach and have the kids exposed to Diary of Anne Frank and work through our Holocaust unit as well. And so that is something that we will use as a whole group.
That's awesome.
Thank you. Sarah?
I have like a whole bunch of questions, but I'm just going to say two that are kind of related, and then another
Top
one.
two.
So I think when you were both talking about how this works in your classroom, I think you kind of answered my question, but I just want to maybe give you a chance to say more. This seems like a model that would work really well for the gifted and the sort of, we talk about trying to keep the lower end, the slower learners, or, people who have extra needs up to speed. But we often forget about those that are flying so high, they're bored, So is this a model that would kind of be able to give you the flexibility as a teacher to kind of say, all right, no, you're not going to read another Captain Underpants. Something a little more challenging, right? Because I have a kid who would have done that, even though he's capable of doing more,
I think that's what's been exciting is in some of my honors classes that because we're teaching a skill, we are teaching kids that reading is extremely complex. Reading and writing are extremely complex. Mm-hmm. And readers don't just think about one thing when they read. They think about multiple things. Mm-hmm. And for these students to think about, okay, how does that big idea connect to what I've already learned and what social issue is coming out here? I mean, there's just so many layers and facets. So when I talk with them and well, if they have questions or I can push their individual thinking to a higher level as to where they're at. Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful part of it.
Yeah.
Tracy?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Tracy, could you speak to some of the different books students read with literary nonfiction?
Sure. A few of the favorites were Unbroken, Young Readers Edition, The Boys in the Boat, Young Readers Edition, I Am Malala, Young Readers Edition, 10 Days a Mad Woman, Nellie Bly, female journalist, one of our first female journalists, Shackles from the Deep,
Awesome.
a wide variety, I'm blanking on, about Harriet Tubman, wide variety of, and students get choice.
Yeah.
And that's the really powerful thing, is that they are excited about reading it because they chose it. I visited with a couple kids the other day, and I said, these are some honor students, and I said, tell me what you thought of our nonfiction unit. And one student who reads so many books I can't even keep up with it said, you know, I've never really read a lengthy nonfiction book like this.
Wow.
And he said, I really enjoy it. And so that was really exciting to me, because it was him reflecting on reading a different genre than he had before, and actually now excited to read more in that genre.
And so in the same note, what about the students that are coming up? Eventually they'll be here that are ELL. How will this fit with the Spanish immersion students? Are we thinking about that yet?
Don Quixote.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. This model, I'm just referring back to the slide on the why, supporting all learners. When you consider the variety of learning levels and needs of an EL student, they may be up to 6 different levels of language and reading acquisition. And so in a whole classroom, if there's just one novel or textbook, that may not be right at their level. But through this, teachers are able to pick texts that represent who they are and their culture. So they're not having to read resources that don't reflect who they are and value their experience, and also have context of culture that they don't understand if they haven't been a part of. And so it's differentiated for that, and it's at the level of the learner and language acquisition to be pushed to the next level of learning.
Can I add? I'd also say that this model is very flexible in that the book selection can constantly be changing. So, for example, if you have a new-to-country student who comes in middle school, it's very possible to give that student a novel in his or her own language to help them continue developing their reading development. Because if they develop their reading development in their first language, that's the best way to do it, and then begin to transfer it into their second or third language or fourth or whatever, as they grow as proficient readers. So that's another really exciting benefit, is that we can, I don't know that we have a lot of selections right now, but I know at the elementary level, especially at Lake Elmo, we're looking at bringing in a wide range of texts for our students, and our Spanish immersion is using this model as well.
We've had conversation with Brookview too, and some of the EL learners they have in their building. And, we have gifted learners and all levels of learners that are also learning the language. And so then those EL learners are able to also accelerate their learning within text and the transition to a different text more quickly, or book.
Yeah, Liz?
And I had, at the meeting when we talked about this before, one of the concerns that I had was a teacher that I spoke to at the elementary level said, I'm finding that this curriculum is wonderful for my high flyers, but I have a hard time when I'm trying to get my struggling readers help. So at the middle school level in particular, do we have interventionists?
We do not.
We don't.
No, and that's something that we wanted to propose to you in some conversations, and in the November 14th meeting, there was a lot of conversation about the intervention support and getting levels to the learners to the next level and what they need. We would love to have conversation and just outline and map what our current MTSS system is in the district, and through an academic lens, social, emotional, and behavioral lens, so that you can see that. And you would see that our intervention services stop in 5th grade. And what we do is we prioritize at kindergarten, and then, we really hit K2 strong, but that's a part of the conversation that definitely needs to be here, is when there are needs outside what a general classroom teacher can provide. what else can we look at?
If you remember, look back to Tuesday, the handout that I gave, and given a couple times, the sheet on what our needs are, or what we think our needs are, that's one of them. We didn't roll that into the top 3 or top 4 in there, but that's one of them, and because at a minimum, we're thinking we need intervention for reading, intervention for math, and support for SEL at the secondary buildings. And I'd go so far to say not just middle school, but also at the high school.
Okay.
Because that's a piece that's really missing from our programmatic set, is kind of on that slide back that you had with, in literature, in this one here. That's where, when we have kids that are still not where they need to be in 6 through 12, what is the intervention support? And under statute, we're really supposed to be providing specific support. Yep, specific support once those kids are identified. So it is a need of ours, we would agree.
So,
I think something else, though, I just want to interject if I can. Historically, when the last recession hit and the stimulus package came out, that's how we got our interventionists. That program stayed around. The funding for it did not. And in some ways, we're always kind of trying to recover for that. So again, the idea is wonderful. I'm not wishing a recession so we get a stimulus package, but I'm saying those are some of the shortcomings. Another one, I think that we're not where we could be, is even in the elementary years in terms of advancement for kids who are ahead of their peers. That enrichment can be a real issue. Again, I've had a couple parents contact me because they felt their kid wasn't challenged enough, and the GATE program or something like it doesn't reach down enough. Sarah?
so then the question I'll say to you, Tracy, if we don't have interventions, I mean, what is that like for you at the middle school level when you have a student that's coming in that's significantly below grade level? I mean, what are your options?
Well, if there are no current supports in place, then I do what all teachers do, which is try to meet kids where they're at.
Yeah.
And so a variety of things I've done this year so far is I've downloaded and paid for audiobooks. And I want the kids looking at text,
And
following
hearing
it and hearing it.
Yeah.
And I tell kids that helps you become a better reader. You're listening to fluent reading, you're seeing those words on the page.
Yeah.
It's absolutely A-okay to do.
Yeah.
And that even helps build their confidence and their skill. The other thing is, one of the really great things is with this model and these book clubs is partnering kids. And I'm very strategic how I do that, because I want kids to feel encouraged and supported with their buddy. And so I'll say, find your buddy, and you should hear those conversations. Okay, I'm going to read through chapter 6 tonight. Can you read through chapter 6? Yeah, I can read through chapter 6. And they encourage one another,
Yeah.
and they talk about the text with one another, and that helps build comprehension. And maybe they didn't understand everything through chapter 6, but they had a buddy to talk it through with. And then, of course, scaffolding my mini lessons and checking in with those kids periodically, or more frequently than other kids, and making sure they have what they need to move forward.
So it would be good to have, oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Did you want to, it would be good to have the interventionists. And we need to have, we're going to put it on the list to really work on the MTSS, that process and what that looks like and what are the options. And when we do that, to bring forward some of these things, if we need additional money in the budget for audiobooks, so you're not using your own money for that, that would be something that, at least for me as a board member, I'd like to hear about all of those things,
Sorry, can I
yeah,
just
go
follow
ahead.
up really quick on that? So would audiobooks be included with this particular curriculum, or that would still be an additional expense?
So with the, what we teach, we've talked a lot about the delivery of the workshop, but as we look at the HMH into literature, that does have audio feature. It has a variety of different multimodal literacies, podcasts, speeches. They curate news articles every single day that are kid-friendly. So if they're already vetted, you can just pull what's going on in the news and pair that to text. So that high school textbook component does have an audio feature for those learners. It also connects to Turnitin.com and Google Docs, so it's platform-friendly with resources we're already using.
We've got
when-
5 minutes left, so I'll turn it back to Rachel and Karen if you want to wrap
And-
up anything.
Yep, and the approval of the proposal of classroom books, novels, and materials, we would go back to the curriculum department and the larger ELA department to get recommendations of what specifically those resources would be. They have ideas of what they want, but that could include more audio materials to fit the needs of learners.
Could I ask one really fast? How many interventionists do you think we would need for both junior, middle schools and the high school?
That's a great question. I wouldn't want to answer that without referring back to the data to see the levels of how many are at high-risk levels and how many are at medium to identify and then base the answer off that, but I could get that to you.
One quick last one too. What is the impact of class size on being able to be successful in this model?
Well, certainly, I think that it makes it, the workshop model makes it easier to reach all kids because I can pull groups of 3 or 4, and I'm still connecting with these kids, weekly and checking in with them. And so we do our best with the kids that come in our room, whether there's 22 or 32. And I think the individual conferencing, small group work that we can do with this. And I'll say that because kids are so engaged in their choice books and in the texts, that really it's just about, can Mrs. Cox move fast enough around the room to get where she needs to go to meet with kids?
Yeah.
So that's what I would.
Yeah, I would echo that. And again, certainly we would love lower class sizes, but and as Mike keeps pointing out, the realities are realities. And so this just makes it more accessible. This makes learning happen every day for every kid. And yeah, I guess I can't offer too much more than that, but
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
I didn't want to take up much time, given the previous meeting, but thank you so much for your work on this. It's amazing. I guess my question is, where are we with this? Are we going to have this on as another action item in an upcoming meeting?
We'll talk about that when the superintendent and chair meet of where we are. Because my point is.
I just want to go on the record with
Sure.
saying I would like to see it as an action item again.
Okay.
Yeah, at some point,
Rachel?
yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. This just opportunity to sit with you and have conversation and have dialogue has been really important to us, and we appreciate that. And we look forward to the conversations within the policy committee to look at how we can put this into practice so that there are checkpoints along the way and conversation along the way so that we're working and moving forward together with the next packages ahead. So thank you for this opportunity and taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I echo that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, and with that, we'll adjourn. We'll reconvene at City Hall for the meeting.
Is there a bus?
Meeting's adjourned.
Good idea.
We'll bus you there, but then you got to get you back to your car. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Because I was like, line projecting, because it confuses me.